So first question, when did the Hebrew people become monotheists according to biblical and rabbinic tradition? And how does that answer affect traditional understandings of other events in Jewish history? They did it in fits and starts. They went back to polytheism periodically. And they started as primitive monotheists under Adam and Noah. And then Abraham confirms this monotheism in its pure direction. It's confirmed by the Sinai covenant under Moses. And so from that perspective, the polytheism of the monarchy period is a degeneration, and the Canaanite religion has nothing to do with Jewish religion, whereas historically we think they are more closely related. And so this is more developed in number 2, which talks about the idea of polytheism, where you have many gods competing, henotheism with one god preeminent, and the others are subordinate but still worshiped from time to time. Think of thou shalt have no other gods before me. There's monolatry, where you're only allowed to worship one god, which is really the prophetic, Yahvism of the pre-exile period. And then finally, monotheism, where you have only one God that exists, and the Hebrews are the special people. So now, what's Yahweh's role in Jewish history, according to the prophets?
Well, it seems to be a lot of punishing and rewarding at strange times, like waiting until after the bad king is dead to issue your threats about changing your ways, even though that the bad king reigned for 55 years and Yahweh said nothing.
Well, remember, he's the God that punishes to the 3rd and 4th generation.
But apparently the first generation is fine. They can do whatever they want. It's only their kids who will suffer.
Well, but he was being rewarded for the goodness of Hezekiah and David.
Well, that's true. That's true. But didn't he say like to the thousandth generation they'll be rewarded?
Interesting.
So really, I mean,
interesting paradox there, right? Because you can have, what if you're good one generation and bad for 2 and good for 4? And you've got this conflicting multi-generational punishment system here.
I guess that's when the warnings come in. You get warnings rather than immediately smited if you have conflicting heritages.
And so what's the bargain that the prophets offer for historical success?
Do whatever we tell you Yahweh wants you to do. Don't worship other gods, and Yahweh will do nice things for you, presumably.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, he made us unique. The whole thing made us unique, made us different, which gave us a unity.
Okay. So there's one special people who have one special God and don't even look at any other gods. Only worship this God and I'll protect you and cause success. And if you are a whore and look around at other people, I will allow you to be destroyed. Any major success in Jewish history is attributed to Yahweh, and Israel's obedience determines whether it's going to be a catastrophe or a success. Remember, as we said last time, that's how most people read history for most of history, was that history was a function of your religious fervor and piety and good behavior. And if there was a catastrophe, it was obviously your fault because you didn't obey the God correctly. Our version of history is relatively new.
There's a show called Norsemen, which it's actually really cool because they film it both in Norwegian and in English. But at one point in it, they finished a big raid, slaughtering a bunch of people and stealing all their stuff. And the one guy's doing like this speech over their loot, saying how, well, we got all this loot and things turned out so well. So obviously, Thor and Odin approves of these actions and they must be good. Otherwise, things wouldn't have turned out so well and we wouldn't get all this cool loot.
Right, of course. Well, plus they were killing them, not us. So now, what are some of the archaeological and textual analysis challenges to the traditional version of the origins? Well, we talked about the use of the god names, the Canaanite religion that we understand, including their pantheon, the Yahweh reformers, when you understand them as new people changing, radicals, as opposed to the conservatives that the Bible presents them as going back to the original. When you change your frame of mind there, it's very important. And we'll see a couple examples of that also next week when we talk about the evolution of the Torah text, because at the end of Josiah's reforms, they observed the Passover. And it says there, and they had never observed that Passover since the days of Joshua. So for for 500 years, they had not observed Passover the right way. What kind of Judaism were they running without doing it right? I mean, it says David studied the Torah. Did he skip those chapters? Like, again, where are you getting this from? But that's, again, a historical conception looking at what was likely the case on the ground and what changed and who wrote it and who wrote the history versus assuming it was all pious and then the degeneration was temporary.
Well, it's a classic case of justifying the traditional or the current social order by going back and making it, ancient and not radical.
Right. Or even claiming that the change you want is the original order. It's a phenomenon that I think his name is Eric Hobsbawm calls traditioning, where you're making something new but claiming it's part of an old tradition. It's going back to the original.
Like making the U.S. a Christian nation again.
Right. That's projecting it back. Although that one's a little more complicated. Not that I'm in favor of any of the people who are proposing Christian nationalism, but there are plenty of examples of state constitutions that had an established church that promoted the teaching of Protestant Christianity in Massachusetts, for example, as part of their basic constitution. Our understanding of separation of religion and government was very different from those of many of the founding fathers, who were not all deists. Some were, and some were actually Christian believers. So Patrick Henry, for example, was much more in favor of religion and government than James Madison. They're both founding fathers from Virginia. So the Christian Nathan thing is taking a kernel of, they're not making everything up, but they're presenting a broader framework that is absolutely very different from the way that many of the founders envisioned the American society developing. Okay, so now sort of the synthetic questions at the end. How does this new understanding of the origins of Hebrew religion impact our concept of Jewish history or Judaism or Jewish identity?
Well, I would say that it tends to take out the exceptionalism, of the Hebrews. It makes them similar to the other groups that were Canaanite, or whatever, Philistine, Canaanite, and they're not just suddenly this special chosen people, but they're evolving out of a milieu of groups that are similar to themselves.
Okay, so a couple things there. They're not like in a bubble unique, and they evolved and changed over time. Rich, yeah.
Well, my identity, of course, is Judaism is an ethnicity. I am the descendant of all these folks, and with whatever their history was, it's not necessarily what they believed. It's just who they were, where the genes come from.
And so you can see that with all these different belief systems at battle within the Israelite society of the time, the idea that one could be Israelite and a Baalist, Israelite and a Yahvist, Israelite and a Yahweh and Asherahist at the same time, but you were all part of one national identity. Well, guess where we are now? We got Jewish people who believe in all kinds of different things.
It's like you could say Democrats and Republicans can all be Americans. Is that hard to believe?
In theory, yes. So this is one of those challenging moments where you realize that Judaism as a religion is a very limiting concept because the beliefs have changed, the practices have changed. I mean, you're going to say King David wasn't Jewish, or you're going to say Hezekiah and Josiah weren't Jewish before they did these changes. I mean, it's sort of ironic. Hezekiah never observed Passover the way he was supposed to, because Josiah is 200 years later and he's discovering, or 150 years later, he's discovering this Passover that he's supposed to be following. So you're saying Hezekiah was Yahvist, but not Jewish enough? So if you understand that being a Hebrew is part of this line of descent or ethnic background or cultural language or something like that, then that's a very different category of thought than assuming there was one core religious idea that went from the beginning in Abraham all the way down through Moses, all the way down through David, all the way down through the main line of kings in religious practice and the priests in Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple and to the exile and back and on. But that's not what really happened. And so if we want to claim a continuity with them, it's not going to be based on beliefs. It's not going to be based on ritual practice. It's going to be based on something else. Also, they made changes. So can we make changes? Maybe so. If the Yahweh radicals so radically transformed it that you don't even recognize what was before as being Jewish, then maybe what we do, which some might not recognize as being Jewish, is also part of that Jewish process of evolution change. We just have the humility to admit that we're doing something new. And we don't have to look back and claim that actually David was a humanist or Hillel was a humanist. I do get people who try to argue that Maimonides was like a closet humanist because he couldn't really admit what he really thought, and he read a lot of philosophy, and I don't need to do that. I mean, he had elements of his thought that were certainly radical for his day, but I don't need to make him a humanist to feel like I have roots. I can have roots in Maimonides in evolution because his openness to philosophy, his willingness to challenge some of those core beliefs is in my direction. It doesn't have to be identical with me. You know, Homo habilis, who learned how to make stone tools, doesn't have to be synonymous with Homo sapiens. It can be an earlier stage in the process. And the last question, I won't share the file because I can just tell you what the question is monotheism an ethical or philosophical advance or not?
For me, clearly no, on both things. And it's really, polytheism requires much less mind warping, I think, mind tricks to try to get your mind around it, because you don't have any of the problems of, you know, an all-powerful, all-good God, where does evil? None of that comes into polytheism. Polytheism sort of presents the world as it is, that, you know, oh, there are beings that do stuff and they get in fights, and that's how we get hurricanes. I mean, it explains the world in a much neater way, in a much easier way, I think, than monotheism. Now, of course, I'm not a theist in either way. So this is purely sort of an abstract looking back kind of thing. But, you know, if I were back in, you know, that time, I would have gone, it's like, well, this, you know, it seems like a stretch that, you know, there's this one God who's, you know, acting in these mysterious ways. It makes much more sense to me that there's a bunch of gods and they're fighting all the time, and that's why the world's a mess.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I'm not visible, so it's kind of hard for me to get the floor, and I'm going to grab it. I would respond to this question with another one, which is, considering the fact that most of us aren't theists, what difference does it make? Does it matter if you believe in one or multiple, one fantasy or multiple fantasies? This isn't what drives us. So I like when Sherwin Wine questioned, why is polytheism supposed to be subordinate to monotheism and lesser? But really, what difference does any of it make?
Well, I'll tell you why I included it, why I think it's important to talk about. I don't think it's a waste of your time.
I'm not saying it's not important to talk about, but that's my input to talk about it.
Right. I mean, first of all, you'll get people all the time who say the most significant achievement of Jewish civilization is monotheism or ethical monotheism. Because after all, who's to say that monotheism is ethical? You could just believe in one God who started everything and doesn't give you rules, or you believe in one God who started everything and doesn't give a crap what happens to you. You know, the idea that God is good, there's no paradox there. If God is all powerful but doesn't care, then no dilemma, right? The dilemma comes from the good and the power. That's when you get both. But if, you know, if we hear all the time that the core idea of Judaism is monotheism, the core contribution to world culture of Judaism is ethical monotheism, and here we're taking that away, then we have to think a little bit about, is monotheism really all it's cracked up to be? Or does it have its own problems to consider? And you'll also get people who say you need a God to be ethical. You need someone to tell you what's right and what's wrong. And if you don't have a God, you can't be a good person. I mean, this is a whole philosophical discussion we had last year in our philosophy class. We don't have to rehash the whole thing now, but that's something you hear all the time. There's a reason why atheists are much further down the list of categories of people that people say they're willing to vote for. Now, 90+% of people are willing to vote for an African American, for a gay person, for a woman, for all these other categories for president. But the three lowest categories are someone who's Muslim, someone who's an atheist, and the lowest is a socialist. Just FYI. The reality is that people still think of one God equals ethics because you need someone to tell you what to do and to enforce the punishments. He knows if you are sleeping. He knows if you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. So be good for goodness sake. Okay. You need that power to behave. And if you don't have it, then what's to stop you from doing terrible things? So this is why I think it is valuable for us to think about this question of, is monotheism really a philosophical advance or not? Because we might argue that humanism is an advance over monotheism because it provides a more reliable basis for ethical behavior. But that we have to grapple with this concept of polytheism, monotheism, and humanism, if nothing else, than to be able to answer the people who say, well, monotheism is the best thing the Jews ever did. It's like canceling corned beef. Can't do that.
I just wanted to just say one quick thing, if that's okay.
Please.
We shouldn't classify all polytheism as one big homogeneous similar, because they're not the same thing. Hinduism, for example, is obviously polytheism, but it's very similar to monotheism in the sense of ethical systems, and we're right and you're wrong, and we'll kill you over it, because we think you're wrong, which explains the Pakistani Indian, situation all the time. But in a lot of other cultures, you have what we might call animism, but it's polytheism, certainly. And they believe in spirits and rocks and stones and sacred pythons and all sorts of things. But there's a great more willingness to say, you know what, we've migrated into this territory. And, there's other gods floating around in these places. We ought to figure out what they are and appease them as well, which is very different from, say, Hinduism, which has a very strict that you carry it with you and it doesn't change depending where you're going. I just want to make that distinction because I think it's important.
There's actually a very interesting book by a scholar from the University of Chicago named Regina Schwartz called The Curse of Cain, The Violent Legacy of Monotheism. And her argument is that monotheism is actually less tolerant than polytheism, because polytheism, you could say, well, you have your god of the hearth and I have my god of the hearth, and you have your goddess of the hunt and I have my goddess of the hunt. And so we call them different names, but no big deal. We can, agree to disagree on what the names are. But monotheism comes in and says, no, you're wrong. There's only one God. He's ours, with one special people, and you can't even say his name. And you can't have any statues, and we have to go in and knock down your statues because you're going to tempt us, and you get this sort of imperialistic model of ours is the only right conclusion because we have the only God with a mouth. When you have multiple gods, there's an idea of multiple revelation of different sources of cosmic truth. You've got the Oracle at Delphi, but the Oracle at Delphi didn't go out and conquer all the other oracles and smash them down. You could go to a different Oracle if you wanted a different divine source for truth. So in some ways, polytheism is different than monotheism, and monotheism may be worse. I mean, one example that Dan Friedman, our Rabbi Emeritus, gave once is that a dictatorship is not an improvement on aristocracy, right? So polytheism is an aristocracy where the nobles get to tell you what to do. And monotheism is a dictatorship where one all-powerful being gets to tell you what to do. Is that really an improvement? It's not democracy. It's not, interactive give and take or responding to circumstances. Rules are good whether or not the author tells you them, that things are good or bad by their impact on people, not by who tells you. And waiting for lightning bolts to enforce ethical behavior is a long wait and not very reliable. You could argue that, yes, monotheism is progress because it does give you one set of rules, and having absolute rules, some argue, is important. Look, even in we who tend to follow a more utilitarian approach to life, we wouldn't kidnap a person, drain them of all their blood, and steal all their organs, even if it would save several lives. Because in a very purely crass utilitarian calculus, okay, one person suffers, but I've saved 12 lives. So it's one death versus 12. Hey! But we have some core values that would inhibit that kind of crass calculus. So having some rules may be useful. And there are people who point to having one God in heaven means all people are on the same plane below. So there's a sort of claim of universal human equality. Again, this conflicts with the tribal nationalism and the tribal monotheism that Hebrew thought evolved. You know, you could come to a philosophic monotheistic conclusion. Sherwin Wine talks about this in his Provocative People book, where a philosophical monotheism decides that there is one ultimate cause to the universe, a la Aristotle. But what the Hebrews did was they went from a national God to making that God the only God. And so that creates a kind of parochial monotheism, where there's one God in charge of everything, but we're his favorite kid. And that leads to all kinds of other challenges and problems. But you could be a philosophical monotheist, and that's why there's a famous phrase, I forget who originally said it, that the God of Aristotle is not the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. You know, that God, this Yahweh God, intervenes in the world, has favorites, you know, has a favorite place to live in Jerusalem, has a favorite people to talk to, has a language that he prefers to use. The God of Aristotle is the first cause at the beginning of the universe and doesn't care what happens afterwards. It's a very different concept of a God. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this tour through Yahvism and the evolution of Jewish thought. Next time we meet, we're going to be talking about the exile from Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple and the creation of this Torah, this first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and how it reflects these different trends as in the divided monarchy. We saw this, the political developments, and certainly in this Yahweh period, the battle between the Elists, the Baalists, the Yahweists, and the different tribes trying to come together in some kind of national identity. And we'll see how this document ultimately helps to accomplish that. And we'll also see, this is the teaser, how writing a few lines in the Torah proves to be a brilliant political maneuver by the Jerusalem priests, who at one stroke managed to eliminate their 2 main rivals for political power. Before the exile, there were basically 3 sources of power: kings, priests, and prophets. After the exile with the Torah, there's only priests. And we'll see how they did that in our next class.